Um, so we're here for the psychology department's career speaker series. We just have right now, I think, two two students in our audience. Um, so we'll be recording this, and it will be available for people to watch in the future. And yeah, and I assume that maybe more students will pop in as the time goes on. So we have an hour today for our speaker. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lorraine LaValle. I'm the social psychologist in the department. And our second speaker in the career series is Mrs. Olivia Jaswal. So Olivia is a licensed school psychologist working in the Prince George School District, and she's been working there since 2008. She works with students, families, and teachers, but she'll describe in detail what the job involves and who she's working with. In terms of background, Olivia did her Bachelor of Science honors degree in psychology from UNBC some time ago. She came to UNBC from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast. So a small community, a small coastal community. And she was my first honors student. So I started back in 2000. And Olivia set this incredibly high standard for subsequent honors students. They should be cursing you. Olivia, for her honors study, which she developed completely on her own, so she wasn't working on my area of research. She examined the psychological benefits of structured writing about everyday stressors. So that's a study where she had students write in different ways about stressors to see if different ways of writing improve their ability to cope with them. And her study was so fabulous that it got published in the Journal of Psychology and Health, which is really an enormous accomplishment for an undergraduate student. So after her undergraduate studies, she went to Edmonton for her professional degree, which is a Master's of Education in Psychological Studies in Education. So that was at the University of Alberta. So she'll be providing a presentation about work in school psychology. And after that, I'll ask her to talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses of the job, because she's had a lot of experience in it. She has really good kind of perspective, wide view on the profession. For those of you in the audience, I'll just ask you when questions pop into your head to go ahead and put them right into the chat. And we might address them right away in the talk, or we might wait and address them after Olivia's finished presenting. But we'll kind of make that decisions as we go along. But go ahead, and when you have the question, stick it in there. So, Olivia, I'm going to turn the mic over to you, and welcome back to UNBC.
Oh, thank you, Lorraine. That was a very generous introduction. Far kinder than I think is warranted, but I appreciate it. Before I dive into my slides, I do feel it's really important to me and for all of us to just take a quick moment to think about where we are, to think about the lands that we occupy, because we do learn and live and work and play and raise our families on stolen ancestral traditional territory. I have not grown up here. I moved here when I was 18. So it's not lost on me through my work and through my everyday interactions in the community how important it is to aim for right relationship with the members of the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation as a guest on their lands. I especially love this time of year on their lands when the snow is starting to fall and Lorraine and I can get out to Otway and go skiing. So thank you for taking this moment with me. So, as Lorraine said, I have an educational journey behind me, just like all of you. I graduated from Chatleach Secondary School in Sechelt on the Sunshine Coast in 2000. At the time, growing up there, the Sunshine Coast was still a collection of rural communities. It's quite a bit built up and more busy these days. Um, but yeah, logging was the primary industry, and I lived in a small town, and we'd have indoor days in elementary school because there were cougars on the field. That sort of upbringing. Like many people in small towns, I couldn't wait to get out. So 7 weeks after I graduated, I moved to Prince George and started my undergraduate studies. I had a bit of an extended timeline because I could not decide on a minor. So I have dual minors in anthropology and resource-based tourism. And I'm about, I think, 3 or 6 credits shy of an English minor as well. So I was busy in those 5 years. And Lorraine very graciously took me on as an honors student. And it was a fantastic opportunity to do research and be introduced to the world of research in that way. I took a gap year between degrees. I ended up working for a local organization as a youth care worker for 2 years. I worked with children and youth in care of the Ministry of Children and Family Development who lived in group home care settings. Most of these youth had trauma backgrounds, and most of them presented with some kind of neurodevelopmental disorder or another. And that really gave me the on the ground residential experience with the complexity that can present in our children and youth. That set me up really well for going to the U of A. That degree I did within the expected timelines. um, and I graduated with an MEd in 2008. And right after my last exam, moved back to Prince George and started my job with the Prince George School District. I've been here, I guess this is my 17th startup. And for a while there, I was also the district partner for School District 57 with the provincial outreach program for FASD, whose mandate is to deliver high quality education opportunities and opportunities for teachers and for support staff and school administrators in supporting children with FASD. More recently, I did serve 2 years on the executive committee with the BC Association of School Psychologists as their ethics and professional conduct chair. So part of that was supporting my colleagues around the province with sorting through ethical decision making and dilemmas in their practice, but also receiving and investigating complaints about ethical conduct of school psychologists. Yeah, so that's me in a nutshell. I do have 2 theses under my belt. One I published only because Lorraine kept me on track, and it was a really fun study looking at how we can affect our mood and our symptoms of physical health through specific types of writing about stress. My master's thesis I did not publish, but it is available in the Library and Archives of Canada website. With that, I was very fortunate to have access to a clinical data sample of children with FASD at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital in Edmonton. And I collected data for a control group, and I looked at attention and executive functioning in children with FASD. So, what is a school psychologist? Like, what is distinct about this profession? This is the definition lifted directly off the BC Association of School Psychologists website. It's a little bit wordy, so I'll paraphrase and add in and change a little bit as I speak. But basically, we are highly trained professionals. We work in the school setting to provide a variety of educational and mental health services. We use our knowledge of child and adolescent development, principles of learning, behavior, motivation, individual differences to provide assessments and also to provide consultation, recommendations, and collaborative services with teachers to address the social, emotional, and academic well-being of students. Our primary audience and clientele are students that experience barriers, either in accessing instruction and learning or demonstrating their knowledge and their understanding. And so we're really uniquely positioned within the school district to provide these kinds of learning services. There's a variety of different things involved in our scope of practice. We in BC, we're facing a staffing crisis. We have for a long time. If you take the CPA's recommended ratio of one school psychologist for every 1,000 students, we should have almost 600 school psychologists practicing full-time in British Columbia in the public school system. Right now, we have just under 200. and not everybody is working full time. So while I'll share information about our full scope of practice, understand that it's going to vary school district to school district. In Prince George, the primary focus of my work right now is psychoeducational assessments, because there are only 4 of us who are licensed and qualified to do level C testing. And that a good example of a level C test is an IQ test. So there are other people in the school district that are well positioned to provide Pro-D and in-services, collaboration and problem solving for IEP development or student learning plan development. So right now, in the short term, I hope our main focus is psychoeducational assessment. I also really, really love multidisciplinary consultation. And that is something that is really great about school psychology, because you work alongside a variety of health and education professionals, and multidisciplinary consultation and collaboration for student educational program planning is just part of the job, right? You don't have to seek out people on your own. You just work with them, right? And you get to talk to them all the time. Providing this kind of service really helps with wraparound care for students with a variety of differences or difficulties. My work is used primarily for educational program planning, but it is also used for transition planning. So I can provide consultative services for students entering kindergarten with diverse needs. I provide assessment and consultation services for students transitioning from elementary to secondary school. And my assessments with 16 to 18-year-olds who are approaching their transition into adult services for people with developmental disabilities, that is a big part of my work, providing those assessments to make sure that they are able to access services and financial benefits when they graduate. When I have time, I love developing and delivering Pro-D opportunities for educators. I find it's not as much of my scope of practice these days as I would like, because there's too long of a wait list for assessments. But that's certainly part of the job. And there's a couple of restrictions to practice that are really important for you to know ahead of time when you're considering if a job as a school psychologist. Per the legislation in British Columbia, school psychology services can only be provided within the learning environment, and this is defined in the legislation. We also have a very restricted scope of diagnosis that we're allowed to make. School psychologists in BC can only diagnose specific learning disorders and intellectual developmental disorder. When we have concerns about other things going on, then we make referrals to the appropriate practitioners. So I want to really zero in on psychoeducational assessments, because not everybody knows what these are or what's involved, or, how do we do them? So essentially, a psychoeducational assessment involves the collection of information from multiple sources for a student who's been referred because of learning concerns. Some of the domains that we look at include cognition, academic skills, visual motor integration, language processing, executive functioning, adaptive behavior, mood and social functioning, and behavior. So we gather this information from multiple sources and then integrate the information into a single cohesive assessment report that the family gets a copy of and goes in the school file. So sources of information typically include a detailed review of the student record. So that's the regular school file, learning assistance files, attendance history, things like that. We also conduct comprehensive interviews with the parents or caregivers, with the teachers, and any other school staff that might be formally involved. Some students spend so much time out of the classroom, the daytime custodian is their go-to person, right? So that would be the person I would interview, right? We also conduct observations of the student in various settings in the school. And that is the part that is really distinct from healthcare-based psychology services or community-based or clinic-based psychologists who don't have access to the school setting. That is the piece that I find really helpful in looking at a student's social interactions and behaviors and adaptive behavior, personal independence. What are they doing on their own, and are they showing maladaptive behaviors to compensate for things that are going wrong for them. That opportunity to observe students in class, in gym, during transitions, on the playground, in line for the bus, that's a really special part of school psychology work, is having that access to that information. I also administer standardized and norm-referenced rating scales to teachers and parents and caregivers. And finally, I do direct in-person one-on-one assessments with standardized measures with my students. So taking all that information and integrating it in a way that's concise and meaningful and relevant and accurate, that is the interesting part of this job and the challenge. You have to be a good writer, and it takes a long time to develop, that kind of skill. The main purpose, of course, is to provide a DSM diagnosis of either learning disability or intellectual disability. And if it's indicated, a BC Ministry of Education and Childcare designation as a student who has inclusive education needs. It's that designation that legally entitles the student to an individual education plan, or an IEP. With that diagnosis always comes an interpretation of that specific child's strengths and weaknesses. Which areas are developing just fine, which ones are strengths, and which areas are underdeveloped, and what can we do about it? How should teachers teach them the way they learn? What kinds of accommodations should be put in place to facilitate learning or to provide accessibility options for different modes of expressing learning? So that's kind of the end purpose of the report, is to communicate that really clearly. And then if I'm concerned about something more like ADHD or autism, or maybe there's, a mood thing going on that I can't diagnose, I can communicate that I'm concerned about these specific signs of blah, 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 and then recommend further assessment or evaluation or some kind of treatment option in the community. Are there any questions yet? I haven't kept an eye on the chat.
No, nothing yet.
All right. I feel like I'm flying through these slides. So there are lots of reasons to become a school psychologist. I've included some of my reasons. They're certainly not exhaustive. I'm sure every school psychologist has their own set of things that they love about this job. I grew up with a mother who's an early childhood educator. I had a daycare in my home for most of my childhood. I really like kids. I think they're hilarious. I think they're interesting. Yeah, I just like kids. So I also find it really helpful with my knowledge base, with my expertise, with my training, to be an effective advocate for children and youth, right? To advocate for evidence-based literacy instruction practices, or advocate for better supports for ADHD, or et cetera, et cetera. I find it really rewarding when I'm able to shift a parent's thinking. If they've got the idea that their child's just being lazy, or they just need to try harder, or they just need to stop talking to their friends in class, when I'm able to provide that alternative narrative that their child is actually trying harder than most and they need something different to be successful, I find that can empower parents, and it can shift the tone of the relationship they have with their child. I like to assist teachers with their practices. Many teachers don't have solid training in critically evaluating research, right? The way that your psychology program at UNBC is training you to do. So when I'm able to translate research in practical ways for educators, and give them things that they can try tomorrow, one or two things you can try differently, I find that really exciting, especially when I hear from them that it went well. I do enjoy the teamwork part of my job. The collaboration and the problem solving is really fun. Ethically and morally, I do feel strongly that it's important for children and youth in British Columbia to have access to publicly funded psychological services. So outside of the healthcare system, schools are the only place where children can have school psychology assessments, or have potential learning disabilities or developmental delay diagnosed. So preserving that access to publicly funded services feels really good to me. So I work full time. I really enjoy the professional autonomy that I have as a clinician. Even though I'm in a framework of collaboration and I work for an institution, I still have complete control over the types of tests I use, when I use them, how I construct my assessments, how I manage my time. That is all very important for maintaining well-being as a worker. I learn new things every day working in my department. I work in the inclusive education department. And so I am next door, literally next door in my cubicle to SLPs, OTs, teachers of the deaf or hard of hearing, teachers of services to the visually impaired, and registered clinical counselors. I do have opportunities to collaborate with community organizations from time to time. I find the individuality of each student really interesting, and I've always liked puzzles, and so this job suits me really well. And I really like to highlight the strengths of each student, share with them what they're good at because they don't always know, and maybe influence their self-talk to be a bit more positive. That said, with all these things I love about the work, I would never do it for free, nor should anybody else. And so it's important that you know some of the information around remuneration if you're considering entering this field. Most school psychologists in BC, oh yes, Lorraine, you have a question.
Yeah, Olivia, Jacob's question is actually an interesting one about, is there access to a school psychologist in the district for kids that are going to private schools?
Right now, from what I understand, the independent schools in Prince George don't have anyone on staff, that they encourage families to seek private clinic psychology assessments. I don't know if with the regulatory changes in BC, if maybe the diocese, for example, might consider contracting services now that school psychologists are allowed to contract in the learning environment. They don't have to be fully employed by the learning environment. It's a bit of a distinction.
But it would be up to them
Yeah,
to make those kind of arrangements. It wouldn't
it
be,
would.
yeah.
Yeah, in Prince George, to the best of my knowledge, licensed school psychologists are employed by School District 57, and we only accept referrals for students enrolled in our school district.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Jacob. I had a query from a senior leadership person in another school district this year asking me to provide a service, like a file review service for a former student of mine no longer enrolled in my school district. And I had to say no because I work for School District 57, not school district number something else, right? So that's kind of nice to be able to have those boundaries. Otherwise, you might feel like you're overwhelmed and working everywhere. But yeah, there was a regulatory change with school psychology in BC recently, and we are allowed to provide contract services in any learning environment, including independent schools and other organizations like the First Nations Education Steering Committee. Yeah. Are there any other questions in the chat?
No, you've covered them.
Okay, super. So yeah, most school psychologists in BC are associated professional members of the BCTF. Some aren't. So like School District 91, for example, Vanderhoof to Fraser Lake, that school psychologist negotiates her own contract. She's exempt, right? So you'll see some variability, but chances are you'd be employed in a school district and be a BCTF member. Right now, the salary range is just about 71,000 at step 1, up to 109,000 at step 10. So you go up a step in the pay grid every year. It takes 10 years to get to the top of the pay grid. In my experience, the salary increase is an average of 2% per year. So you can kind of project, like, if you're going to enter the field in 4 years, what might the salary be? We are category 6. That means we have an integrated degree at the undergraduate level and a master's degree. So for school psychologists, it's a bit different. We don't have an integrated degree like teachers, but we do have an internship as part of our graduate studies. And so that's what counts towards that language around integrated degree. Our pay seems lower than what you could potentially make as a registered psychologist in private practice. However, there's important distinctions to be made to know why this is actually a reasonable salary. We are 10-month employees. We do not get paid for the summer months, but our salary does include pay for the winter break and the spring break. So that's 4 weeks of vacation, like the equivalent of, right? Um, and there we go. We also have a defined pension plan. So that's a really, really important part of remuneration. If you're in private practice, you won't have a pension plan necessarily, and you'll have to save for your own retirement. We also have extended medical and dental benefits, and our MSP fees are paid. We have life insurance for the duration of employment. Um, Here's a few big ones coming up. Our assessment materials and the like technology, like our assessment iPads, our laptops, these are purchased and maintained by the employer. I'm never out of pocket for my test materials. My annual registration fee with the college, which is just over $1,300 per year, is reimbursed by my employer. I'm also covered by the school's protection program, which meets the liability insurance requirements of the college that governs me. So those are some pretty big overhead fees that you would be handling on your own in private practice. So these are definitely perks worth considering if you want to work as a school psychologist. I also every year get a little bit of funding from my employer that goes towards my continuing competency requirements. My college does require me to put in 35 hours a week, or not per week, sorry, 35 per year minimum, developing my competency and making sure that I am qualified to continue practicing. By the way, School District 57 does offer paid internships to graduate students who are in their training programs. And unless it goes very poorly, you are pretty much guaranteed an offer of employment. We have been staffed at 50% what we should be for several years. And so we are always looking to recruit new members for our team. Now, are there any questions about remuneration?
No.
Okay. So another
Oh,
thing,
actually, I'm
oh,
sorry,
yeah,
Olivia.
yeah.
I have one question. So is
Mhm.
your defined benefits, is it defined that defined contributions or defined benefits? Do you know?
I don't know what the difference is, but basically it's different from an RRSP. So I will receive a pension through my retirement years for the rest of my life. That pension will not run out of money, whereas my RRSP might,
Yeah.
depending on my lifespan and my spending habits, right? Yeah.
So that sounds like defined benefits, which again
Mm,
for students, that's exceptional. So that
mhm.
we don't have that kind of pension plan here at the university, and it's hard to get those. So that's terrific, a terrific benefit.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I was curious once the legislation changed and I was able to provide contracted services instead of being employed by an institution. I did kind of do some financial planning and look at, is it worth it to go into private practice? It does seem like community-based psychologists make an awful lot more than I do. But when I factored in the overhead, um, it came out about even, right? The overhead and then like the pension is a big one. And if you develop some kind of chronic health condition that's expensive to manage, it's really helpful to have that extended medical as part of your benefits package. Or if you end up being a parent and having a child who has medical expenses, right? Yeah, so I think those are important things to factor in, not just looking at the salary itself, because that can be a bit misleading, right?
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
There are some questions about the internship, but I'm going to wait and let you finish. You know,
Sure. Good
yeah.
idea. Because my next slide after this will talk a bit about training programs. So
Okay.
that might dovetail really nicely. Um, so I'm starting out, before I talk about training programs, we need to talk a little bit about the regulation of psychology in British Columbia because the Health Professions and Occupation Act was amended. It was changed. And I won't get into all the details because I don't want to confuse anybody, but the Psychologist Regulation and the Health Professions Act, they were updated to include school psychologists. We weren't always included. We weren't officially registered, regulated, licensed, etc. And so there was great opportunity for potential harm to the public by unqualified practitioners working and providing school psychology services, right? So now we are all officially regulated as of May 1st, 2024. So this is all pretty new for us. It's great to look at the psychologist's regulation when you're weighing your pros and cons or making decisions about whether you'd like to be a licensed school psychologist or a registered psychologist. The psychologist's regulation document, it outlines things like the scope of practice and what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. Um, all psychologists in BC must be registered or licensed with the College of Health and Care Professionals of BC. At the end of June of this year, this brand new college formed. It's an amalgamation of different professional colleges. The College of Psychologists of BC was one of those colleges that was amalgamated into this new CHC PPZ. Say that 5 times fast. I usually say it wrong. Roughly, or like generally speaking, licensed school psychologists are typically trained at the MEd level or MSc level. Many programs offer an MA stream, and you have to look carefully to decide if that gives you what you need to be in practice in the school setting, or if it's setting you up for a career in school psychology research. Some of the programs I've come across, the MA is actually a research stream, so it's good to look carefully. The College of Health and Care Professionals of BC website is where you want to go to look at the applicant requirements, and it's going to list the courses that you have to have, the type of program you need to have completed, if you need an internship, how many hours, et cetera, et cetera. Registered psychologists in British Columbia do not have a restricted scope of diagnosis or where they can work. So if you're interested in like a full scope of practice, that might be a better option. I'm very happy with having an MEd and having a limited scope of practice because I can really specialize and have expertise in my specific field, but not everybody wants that kind of restriction. So once you understand what you need educationally for being registered or licensed in BC, that is when you're going to look at the various training programs. This list is not exhaustive, but this is some of them. And the CPA also has an info sheet that you can take a look at. Not all programs offer everything, and so that's why it's good to compare their programs of study with what's required by the college here in BC. Also paying special attention to residency hours. Some programs offer hybrid learning options or, online learning options, and you may not be set up for licensure in BC. I don't know. I can't say I don't work for the college, but it's good to kind of check all these things out before you apply to various training programs. The standard in BC is to complete an internship as part of your graduate studies. And so you do that following the guidelines or like the expectations of the university that you're enrolled with. We provide the clinical supervision kind of as stipulated by the institution. So if you were to do your internship in School District 57, chances are I would be your clinical supervisor, and I would structure it in a way that you're also working closely with the other school psychologists. So you get a feel for different styles of practice and different ways of managing the workload. And so this is where we should really open it up for questions. And I know in 20-25 minutes, I've just scratched the surface and given you a little bit of information about it. And I'm always happy to meet with you at my office and talk more in depth about this as a career option and to show you where I work and show you a bit more about what's involved.
Thank you, Olivia. Julie, have you been monitoring the questions as well? Do you want to take that away?
Sure. And I'm just going to sort of go through them in the order they were put into the chat. And I may paraphrase a little bit. Some I think you partially covered, but maybe it was missed or just more details are being looked for. So one of the questions you said that you observe the children in schools. So I presume you're actually going into the schools and watching them in their classroom. The question was, do you directly work in different schools in School District 57? So are you assigned to just one school, or do you just go to wherever the child is that you've assessed? Like, How does that school to you relationship work?
That is a great question. When I first started and we were fully staffed, I had year to year anywhere from 6 to 11 schools in my caseload, and I'd visit each one regularly. School psychologists don't provide any direct services to students without informed consent from their legal guardians. So without consent, I could help teachers with their class management, doing general observations and building capacity in that way. I could work with support and learning assistance teachers, looking at like a MTSS or like response to intervention model and progress monitoring tools for dyslexia interventions that they're doing. I could do general work like that without consent. And there were monthly extended school-based team meetings, one in each school every month, where the SLP, the school psychologist, counselor, and the school-based team would get together and discuss student referrals and do collaborative problem solving. We've been so critically short-staffed that we made the difficult decision of changing our model a couple of years ago. So instead of having a set caseload of certain schools, there are 3.6 full-time equivalent school psychologists. So we're very assessment focused now because our wait list is so long that we just really need to get it under control. We don't go to extended school-based team meetings at this time, but we do take assessment referrals. We have one centralized wait list, and that was meant to build equity between schools so that every student, no matter what school they're in, has an equal chance of having their assessment done within a reasonable timeline. So I will sign up just for the next student on the wait list and go to whatever school they're in. And I try to head out to Mackenzie once or twice a year. So far I've been able to get that caseload. I really enjoy it. But so yeah, right now we do not work in specific schools. But we can and we should, but it depends on staffing.
Right. Someone asked what it looks like when you contract out. So if you are contracted out, does that essentially end up looking the same, or would it really depend on the contract? Or
I don't know anyone who's doing that, and I've never done it. Essentially, you would be a sole practitioner, right? So my understanding of it is you would be running your own business, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily be employed like I am, right? So some of those like financial compensations, like for your overhead, you'd have to pay for your own records management to make sure you're compliant with the privacy and information legislation in BC. You'd need to buy your own test equipment. And I think you'd be able to structure your own contracts. The difference is I don't think that school psychologists who are doing contract work are allowed to bring students to a clinic setting. They have to be doing the assessments in the school setting. That's my interpretation of the legislation. I don't know if I'm totally right, but that's what it sounds like to me. So that does make it a bit different than a registered psychologist who runs a clinic practice, right?
right. And I had just a break. I have the list of questions here, but you were mentioning doing the assessments and what you were allowed and not allowed to assess and what you had to refer on. And at one point you mentioned a referral for ADHD. That's often seen, even I guess, just colloquially as a learning block, but so that's not something you're allowed to assess. That's not on your list.
That's very interesting, isn't it? And it is an area of current advocacy for the BC Association of School Psychologists. Many of us feel strongly that ADHD is so common and it so commonly co-occurs with specific learning disorder and autism and FASD. And compared to how it is screened, evaluated, and diagnosed by family physicians and pediatricians, it seems reasonable to me that school psychologists are well trained and positioned to also diagnose it, but right now it is restricted in the legislation. So
Interesting.
yeah, it is very interesting. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe there's a concern about overdiagnosis. I'm not exactly sure. I know that it's time consuming to amend legislation and associated regulations. So hopefully that changes. I do screen for ADHD. I do provide really descriptive doctor letters or really descriptive paragraphs in my reports recommending that a physician or a pediatrician, somebody take a look at it and rule it in or out because it is an important component for learning. And many, anywhere from 15 to 20% of students who have ADHD need more than just behavioral strategies, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
many of them, behavioral strategies and accommodations are not enough, and they would do benefit from multimodal treatment.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I still have three more student questions, but just to jump out of order because this is relevant to what you just said. When you do an assessment, do you refer a child to specific services?
Yes and no. So as a community partner, I have to be careful about my language. I can't say this student needs Community Living BC services. I can say this student's family should consider or is encouraged to apply for, and then I provide the evidence or the forms that they need. Um, yeah, so I can't be directive, but I can make targeted recommendations, right? I can
Mhm.
provide encouragement, right? So, hey, this child with a newly diagnosed intellectual developmental disorder may benefit from services through children and youth with support needs. If this child's guardian initiates an application with the CRA for the disability tax credit and shares the code with me, I am happy to fill out the tax forms, things like that. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes
Yeah.
almost a read between the lines kind of a statement.
Yeah, or like encouraged to.
Hmm.
It's an ethical kind of
Hmm.
tightrope walk sometimes, especially for some of our more vulnerable families who may have had past contact with MCFD. Maybe there's care or guardianship concerns. Um, I don't want to be that school psychologist who then says you should or you must apply for the tax credit or this specific service, and then the parent doesn't or chooses not to or can't, and that's a reason for the child to be apprehended or not returned in timely fashion, or I don't want to be in that position to be that prescriptive, right?
Right, right.
Mhm.
Okay, so back to the list of questions that had come up in order in your presentation. Um, you had the slide all about the remuneration and the various costs that are covered. Is there a source that someone can go to find that information?
I think the BCTF pay grid is available. Just, you could Google it. I'm pretty
Okay,
sure that's public access.
okay.
I'm not sure about the pension plan and all of that. And the medical and dental benefits package is renegotiated every time the collective agreement is negotiated.
Mhm.
So, like for example, just this July, we became eligible for the shingles vaccine to be covered, where it never was before. So those details do change from bargaining period to bargaining period. The school protection program is just something that's purchased at the provincial level that every school district has. I don't even have to think about it. The continuing competency or Pro-D funding, that does vary year to year depending on budget cuts and depending on the school district. So I have colleagues who are receiving nothing this year, whereas we are still receiving help with that cost in Prince George. And then the college registration fee, that annual fee to remain licensed, that is in the collective agreement for BCTF associated professionals. So that will always be covered no matter how much it costs, right? Unless we lose that, but I don't think we'll lose it.
Good. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, so there's two more questions that work well together and also sort of blend into a question I had of my own. The questions were, where can one find the details? No, sorry. What does the internship look like during grad school? And can one do it from the MEd counseling program here? Which is when I noticed that you didn't list UNBC on that list of schools. So sort of three questions in one, I
Yeah.
guess.
So this is actually a really, really common misunderstanding among lay people, among other like clinical professionals or healthcare professionals, among teachers, parents. Everybody thinks that counseling and school psychology are the same thing, and they're not. So UNBC does have an MEd counseling program, and it does not qualify you to apply to be a licensed school psychologist. There just simply isn't the right coursework. It's different training and it's a different field of practice.
Wow.
Yeah. So my hope is that just like with the OT and PT program and the Northern Medical program, that hopefully UNBC one day might partner with UBC, and they've got a really great school and applied child psychology program. Right now, they're only accepting PhD stream students because they have a faculty shortage. So they haven't accepted MEd program applicants for some time, but I thought, what a great opportunity to cultivate the field in the North, if we could have a satellite program or support training in the North.
Right, right. So that covers
Yeah.
sort of the second two questions. So I guess the first one then, if you're going to another school, what does the internship during your grad program look like?
You know, I'm not well positioned to answer that because I didn't do an internship. So I graduated like, oh gosh, like a while ago, right? I went to the U of A, and I don't know about now, but at the time there was no internship included in that program, which was really interesting. And at the time I was able to certify with BCASP. I wasn't regulated by a college, that wasn't in the legislation at the time. And I cobbled together my own like equivalent of an internship here through mentorship and supervision with colleagues. Yeah, so I suspect, or I would assume every university program has their own sort of internship components, right? Or guidelines or policies or whatever. And then we get a copy of it when we get an intern applicant. And we typically have had interns come from the University of Calgary. And so they have a specific, checklist of what needs to be included in the internship, what kind of supervision and like reporting back to the internship coordinator, what kinds of evaluative tools are completed by the supervisor. And we're happy to accommodate the requirements depending where you're enrolled, right?
All right.
So I expect it would vary depending where you're enrolled, and we can accommodate what you need.
Mhm.
Can I just jump in there too and follow up, Julie? And Olivia, how long are they typically with you, the interns?
They are on our team and they're paid for the full school year.
Mm,
So the
okay.
Tuesday after Labor Day until the last work day of June. From what I've observed from the sidelines, our interns are required to complete their hours and their summative assessments, I think, by the end of the winter semester.
Mm.
So there's usually a bit of a time crunch, maybe working some extra hours or overtime like February, March to try to get all those hours in. It's usually about 1,500 hours, I think. But then once you're done the internship, you've met the graduation requirements and you're able to continue working in our school district for the remainder of the school year. And hopefully you want to stay and get a continuing contract with us. The internship here is paid at category 4 on the pay grid. So the salary range is different as an intern, but as soon as you are hired on as a licensed school psychologist, and if you're paperwork that shows you have a master's degree, then you get bumped up to category 6.
Nice. Okay, so I believe we just have one final question. I'm just going to read it out exactly. Jacob says, when I've been looking into grad school, there's a school psychology with a specialization, for example, in applied behavior analysis. What does that look like?
I'm not sure. We haven't had any interns come through those kind of programs.
Okay.
Yeah, being certified in ABA is not a requirement of this job. In this school district, we don't, like school psychologists are not involved in doing ABA. We do have registered clinical counselors that are employed here as district mental health and behavior clinicians, and they sometimes use functional behavior analysis as part of their work, but I'm not overly familiar with it in our setting here.
Okay. Well, that is the end of the questions that were asked throughout, and at the very end, if I believe we still have a couple of students still in the room. If you have any further questions for Olivia, we've got a few minutes left.
Yeah, and Julie, did you ask Jacob's question, when you do an assessment, do you
Oh,
refer
sorry,
child to specific services?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Okay.
I jumped ahead to that when we were talking about assessment.
Okay.
That one I should add that part of my reticence in like being prescriptive about, accessing other providers or services in the community is that I also don't like it when other service providers say a child must have a school psychology assessment. Because
Mm,
in our model, I take referrals from schools, from teachers. I don't take them from pediatricians or doctors or interventionists or et cetera, right? And so I feel like that's also part of kind of respectful conduct. I don't say, oh, this child must see a pediatrician, right?
mhm. Does that also mean then that you can't provide a referral in terms of like the parents even know, okay, you've recommended this next step, and that is indeed what I want to do, but you then can't give a direct referral. I don't know. I hate to say to make them jump the
Yeah.
line, but sometimes some places it's better to get in with a referral.
I think the way things are structured in BC kind of remove that option.
Mm,
So
yeah,
pediatricians only take referrals from other physicians, right?
right.
Or the Northern Health Assessment Network, their autism clinic only takes referrals from physicians, nurse practitioners, and SLPs, right? So that's
Mm,
not even an option for me. Their complex developmental behavior conditions clinic only accepts referrals from healthcare providers, right? Not me. Yeah, so in many cases that's not even a worry of mine because I'm not allowed anyways.
right, right.
Olivia, you nicely outlined what you like about the job and love about the job and why, the job has been a good fit for you. Is there a downside to the job? Are there negatives?
Um, well, I think that the staffing shortage is a perennial downside. Like no matter where you work in British Columbia, pretty much everywhere is short-staffed.
Mm.
When I entered the field, I think the median age of school psychologists in North America was 55.
Oh, wow.
So we've lost a lot of
Wow.
people to retirement.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so there's that. I mean, there's that idea of moral injury, right? Like, and that leads to burnout. Like, if you feel like things are just unfair, if you feel like things are terrible. That part of the downside or the difficulty of my context here, like short staffing is not going to change. I can't allow myself to feel morally outraged about it, right? Or start thinking about what other people should be doing, or you know.
Hmm.
um, so managing stress, right? Managing feelings of pressure or guilt or whatever associated with having a long wait list and not being able to do all that much about it. That is a downside, and that is an area where people need to cultivate resilience in this line of work, right? Um, there can be frustrations, just like in any workplace, any career that you take, there's going to be frustrations here. There are systemic shortcomings, right? Any system is going to have shortcomings, right? Education, there's shortcomings related to the funding model, relating to, human resources capacity, relating to like, are we training enough teachers in BC? Like, there's so many things that are not inside my control, right?
Yeah.
So those kind of pressures are things to be mindful of and have the right kind of mindset about. And before I did the math, I thought maybe the remuneration wasn't all that great, but after crunching the numbers, now I'm quite satisfied.
Hmm. Yeah. So, any are two students? Anyone want to, come online and ask any questions, or do you feel like you've had all of your questions answered? Well, I guess good. I guess it looks like you've done a good job. There's been both the students were thanking you, Olivia,
Oh,
and
well, thank you for joining me. I know it's a busy
yeah,
time of year.
yeah. I'll just mention our speaker next week is going to be Rebecca Poser, who's a mental health therapist for over 6 years at Intersect Youth and Family Services. And that talk is going to be on Thursday from 12:30 to 1:30. So make sure that you have that in your calendar. And yeah, and you have Olivia's contact information, and do feel free to follow up with her, I want to be a school psychologist now. Maybe in
It's never
retirement.
too late.
Do you have any plans? You don't have plans. I think I ask you this whenever we get together to do a PhD and to actually, start a school psych program here at UNBC. Any ambitions for that?
Oh, I'm pretty well rooted here. So to do a PhD in school psychology, I'd have to move away.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I have two kids here now. They're school aged and they're in a fantastic school and they have great friends. And my husband's work here is going really well. And yeah, my motivation to do a PhD is pretty low.
Yeah, and there isn't a kind of an online version of that. Is that right? That you can't like U of C isn't offering a kind of
Um,
distance PhD.
I haven't looked into it. I prefer in person, and I think if I were
Yeah.
to do it in clinical school psychology, like to be able to diagnose ADHD or anxiety disorders or etc., I would want to be in person. That would be my preference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and yeah, enjoy the snow out there. And Olivia, I'll just, if you can hang on, maybe we just can have a little opportunity to chat. And Julie, same.